Imagine you're cleaning out your grandmother's attic. You open an old wooden box, one that hasn't been touched for more than 100 years. Inside, you find a faded black and white family photograph. At first, everything looks completely normal. A mother sits in a chair. A father stands beside her. And a young child rests quietly between them. Nothing seems unusual. Nothing seems out of place. But then, you notice something strange. The child isn't smiling. The child isn't moving. And there is something unsettling about those eyes. The longer you look, the more uncomfortable you become. Then suddenly, you realize the horrifying truth. The child in the photograph isn't sleeping. The child isn't posing for the camera. The child is dead. Yet somehow, the family is sitting beside the body, as if nothing is wrong. No fear. No panic. No attempt to hide what happened. In fact, they paid a photographer to capture this moment forever. Today, most people would find this shocking. Some would even call it disturbing. But during the Victorian era, photographs like this were surprisingly common. Thousands of families across America and Europe willingly posed with their dead loved ones. Children, parents, brothers, sisters, even newborn babies. And the deeper you look into these photographs, the darker the story becomes. Because these weren't simply pictures. They were the final memories of a world where death was a part of everyday life. A world where saying goodbye looked very different from what it does today. Tonight, we're uncovering one of history's strangest and most unsettling traditions. The forgotten world of Victorian post-mortem photography. Welcome to Chronospecture History. And trust me, the photographs you're about to see become more disturbing with every image. Let's begin. The year was 1856. A photographer in New York received an unusual request. A family wanted a portrait. At least, that's what it sounded like at first. Family portraits were becoming popular across America. People wanted to capture important moments. A wedding. A birthday. A new child. Or simply a memory that could last forever. But when the photographer arrived at the house, he quickly realized this was not an ordinary portrait session. The curtains were closed. The atmosphere was silent. And every member of the family was dressed in black. In the center of the room sat a young girl. She appeared to be around 6 years old. She wore her favorite dress. Her hair had been carefully brushed. And her hands rested neatly in her lap. At first glance, she looked perfectly normal. Almost as if she were waiting for the photograph to begin. But there was one problem. The little girl had died the day before. To modern eyes, the scene sounds unimaginable. But to the family, this was an act of love. You see, photography was still new. Most families could not afford regular photographs. Many people went through their entire lives without ever having their picture taken. For some children, the only photograph they would ever have was taken after death. As heartbreaking as it sounds, this portrait was not meant to celebrate death. It was meant to preserve a memory. A final chance to remember a face, before time erased it forever. The photographer carefully arranged the scene. The parents stood beside their daughter, trying their best to remain still. Exposure times were long in those days. Sometimes people had to hold their pose for several seconds, or even minutes. When the photograph was finally taken, the family thanked the photographer, and the image was placed inside a decorative frame. Years later, visitors would see the photograph hanging on the wall. Most would never realize that one person in the picture was already gone. But this family was far from alone. Across Victorian America and Europe, thousands of similar photographs were being taken. And some photographers became experts at making the dead appear alive. The techniques they used were far stranger than anyone could have imagined. To understand Victorian death photography, you first have to understand something about the Victorian world. Death was everywhere. Today, most people rarely see death in their daily lives. Hospitals handle it. Funeral homes manage it. And many families are separated from the process entirely. But in the 1800s, things were very different. Death was not hidden. It happened at home. It happened in front of family members. And it happened far more often than people today can imagine. A simple infection could become deadly. A fever could take a child within days. Diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and smallpox swept through cities and towns with terrifying speed. There were no antibiotics, no modern vaccines, and very few effective treatments. For many families, losing a child wasn't a rare tragedy. It was a painful reality. Some parents buried multiple children during their lifetime. Imagine celebrating a child's birthday one week, and planning their funeral the next. For Victorian families, that nightmare was all too common. In some communities, so many children died young that families lived with a constant fear. Every cough, every fever, every illness could be the beginning of the end. And because life was so uncertain, people viewed death differently. They didn't treat it as something distant. They treated it as part of life itself. Children grew up attending funerals. Families kept mourning clothes ready. Homes often contained locks of hair from deceased relatives. Some people even wore jewelry made from the hair of loved ones who had passed away. To modern eyes, it feels strange, even unsettling. But for Victorians, these were acts of remembrance. Ways to keep the memory of someone alive. And then, a revolutionary invention arrived, a technology capable of freezing a single moment forever. Photography. For grieving families, it seemed almost magical. For the first time in human history, a face could be preserved exactly as it appeared. No artist required. No painted interpretation. Just reality. Captured forever. And when death came unexpectedly, many families saw photography as their final opportunity. Their last chance. Their last memory. Their last goodbye. But as demand for these photographs grew, photographers began developing shocking methods to create them. Methods designed to make the dead look alive. Methods so convincing that some Victorian death photos still fool people today. In 1839, the world was introduced to a remarkable invention: photography. For the first time in history, people could capture reality itself. Not a painting, not a sketch, but an actual image of a person, exactly as they appeared. To us, taking a photograph is effortless. Pull out a phone, press a button, and the moment is saved. But in the Victorian era, photography was something special, something rare, something expensive. Many families spent weeks, or even months, saving money for a single portrait. And because photographs were so costly, most people owned very few of them. Some families had only one photograph. Others had none at all. Then tragedy struck. A child became sick. A mother passed away unexpectedly. A father never returned home. And suddenly, the family realized something heartbreaking. They had no photograph. No image. No visual memory to hold on to. Only fading recollections. And memories fade. Faces become harder to remember. Details disappear. Voices are forgotten. For grieving Victorians, this was a terrifying thought. The fear of losing someone forever was matched only by the fear of forgetting them. That's why post-mortem photography became so important. Not because people were obsessed with death, but because they were desperate to preserve life. The photograph became a final connection, a final memory, a final piece of the person they loved. Many parents viewed these photographs as precious treasures. Some kept them in albums. Others displayed them in their homes. A few carried miniature versions with them wherever they went. To outsiders, it might seem disturbing. But to grieving families, these photographs represented comfort. Proof that their loved one had existed. Proof that they had been here. And for many families, there would never be another chance. The camera had arrived too late. The child was already gone. So the final portrait became the first portrait as well. A heartbreaking reality repeated thousands of times across the Victorian world. But as demand grew, photographers discovered something unexpected. Families didn't just want photographs of the dead. many wanted something far stranger. They wanted photographs that made the dead appear alive. And what happened next would create some of the most unsettling images in history. As post-mortem photography became more common, a strange expectation began to grow. Families didn't always want the truth. They wanted comfort. And comfort, in the Victorian mind, often meant the illusion of life. So photographers began developing techniques, not just to capture the dead, but to make them look alive. At first, it was simple adjustments. A body would be carefully positioned in a chair. A father might be placed beside his child. A mother might hold her baby, as if nothing had happened. Photographers would adjust clothing, fix hair, and arrange hands in natural positions. But there was one major challenge. The body was no longer living. It could not sit upright on its own. It could not balance. It could not pose. So photographers used hidden supports. Metal stands were placed behind bodies to hold them upright. Some were so well hidden, you could only notice them if you looked closely. Then came another technique. Photographers would sometimes open the eyes of the deceased. Carefully. Manually. In some cases, they even painted eyes onto closed eyelids, to create the illusion of awareness. And when exposure times were long, families would be placed in the frame, while the body was positioned carefully in the center. Everyone had to remain completely still. Even a small movement could ruin the photograph. But the goal was always the same. To make death look peaceful. To make it look natural. To make it look almost alive. Some photographers even went further. They placed toys in the hands of deceased children. Books on their laps. Flowers around their bodies. As if the person was simply resting, not gone. And surprisingly, many families accepted this illusion. Because the truth was too painful to face directly. A lifeless body was unbearable, but a peaceful sleeping figure was easier to accept. And so, these photographs became a blend of reality and performance. Half truth, half illusion. But everything changed when photography studios realized something important. This was not just a cultural practice anymore. It was becoming a business. And the business of death photography was about to grow in ways no one expected. As the demand for post-mortem photographs grew, something unexpected happened. Photography stopped being just an art. And slowly, it became a business built on grief. In many Victorian cities, photographers began offering mourning portraits as a service. Some even advertised directly to grieving families. They promised something simple, yet deeply emotional. A final image. A lasting memory. A way to say goodbye. For families in shock, this offer felt almost necessary. Because when death came suddenly, there was often no time to prepare. No time for proper remembrance. No time for closure, and photographers filled that gap. Some studios even specialized in this work. They kept props ready at all times. Small chairs. Child-sized furniture. Black mourning drapes. And decorative frames meant for memorial portraits. In some cases, photographers would be called to homes immediately after a death. Before burial. Before decomposition. Before the moment was lost forever. Time was critical. Sometimes the body had already begun to change, so photographers had to work quickly. Very quickly. But not all studios were the same. Some approached it with respect. Almost like a sacred duty. Others saw opportunity. Because post-mortem photography was not rare anymore. It was in demand. And wherever demand exists, prices follow. Families were often charged more for these sessions than regular portraits. Especially if the photographer had to travel. Or stay for long preparation. Or restore the appearance of life. And slowly, a strange shift began. Death was no longer only a personal tragedy. It became a service. A product. A transaction. Some photographers even built reputations for their lifelike results. The more realistic the illusion, the more clients they attracted. And in a time when grief was overwhelming, Many families didn't question the process. They simply wanted one thing: to see their loved one last time, as if they were still there. But behind the studio curtains, something darker was beginning to emerge. Because not every photograph told a peaceful story. Some were far more unsettling. And a few were so strange that they still haunt historians today. By the late 1800s, something important was changing. Photography was no longer rare. It was no longer expensive. And it was no longer limited to special moments. Cameras became faster, cheaper, and far more accessible to everyday people. For the first time, families didn't need to wait for tragedy to capture a memory. They could photograph life itself. Birthdays, weddings, family gatherings, even simple everyday moments. And this shift changed everything. Because post-mortem photography existed for one major reason. It was often the only chance to preserve a face. But now, that need was fading. Families already had albums full of living memories. Smiling portraits. Natural expressions. Moments that actually represented life, not its end. At the same time, society's relationship with death was also changing. In the Victorian era, death was visible, present, part of daily life. But as cities modernized, death slowly moved away from the home. Hospitals began taking over end-of-life care. Funeral services became more formal. And death became something people experienced less directly, less personally, and more privately. As this shift continued, post-mortem photography started to feel less familiar and more uncomfortable. A new generation grew up with different expectations. They didn't see death as something to be photographed. They saw it as something to be hidden, something private, something final. And slowly, the demand for these photographs declined. Photographers stopped advertising them. Studios stopped offering them. And families stopped requesting them. But the images didn't disappear. They remained in old albums, hidden in drawers, stored in forgotten boxes, waiting to be rediscovered decades later. And when people finally began finding them again, they misunderstood what they were seeing. Because without context, these images looked disturbing, even horrifying. But for the people who created them, they were never meant to shock. They were meant to remember. Still, there is one question that remains. A question that even historians struggle to fully answer. Why did Victorians feel the need to preserve death so intimately, instead of avoiding it? And the answer goes deeper than photography. It leads into something far more human.
By the late 1800s, something important was changing. Photography was no longer rare. It was no longer expensive. And it was no longer limited to special moments. Cameras became faster, cheaper, and far more accessible to everyday people. For the first time, families didn't need to wait for tragedy to capture a memory. They could photograph life itself. Birthdays, weddings, family gatherings. As photography spread across Europe and America, something unexpected started to happen. The images became more personal and far more disturbing. In some photographs, deceased children were carefully positioned in chairs, as if they were simply resting. Their clothes were adjusted, their hair neatly brushed, and toys were placed in their hands to create the illusion of life. At first glance, it looks peaceful, almost normal, but the stillness gives it away. As the 1900s approached, the world was changing fast. Photography was evolving, and so was society's relationship with death. Cameras became cheaper. But the real question is, why did Victorians feel the need to capture death so closely in the first place? The answer is not as dark as it seems. It is deeply human. In a world